The handout's pretty bare today. It's just pictures except for a prayer. And the prayer is from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls texts. I'm going to talk about it a bit. So let us pray. I thank thee, O Lord, for thou didst shed thy Holy Spirit upon thy servant. All these things thou didst establish in thy wisdom. Thou didst appoint all thy works before ever creating them. The host of the spirits and the congregation of thy holy ones, the heavens and all their hosts, and the earth and all it brings forth, in the seas and the deeps, and in everlasting tasks, for thou hast established them from before eternity. Amen. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm going to start with a little story. So about 2,000 years ago, a holy man appeared in Israel, Palestine. He gathered a group of disciples around him and started a new community based on what he called a new covenant between God and Israel. To become a member of this community, you had to go through a ritual of being washed in water, or baptized obviously, and they understood this as symbolically pointing to the Holy Spirit forgiving a person's sins. After the founder of this community died, the community continued to meet daily, and they would do so by having a meal of bread and wine, in which they would celebrate and await the return of the Son of David and the coming of the kingdom of God. Who am I talking about?
It's usually a trick.
It is a trick. Right? Right? So I'm not talking about Jesus, though it sounds a whole lot like Jesus. I'm talking about a person whose name we don't actually know, other than that of the Dead Sea Scrolls text. He's referred to as the teacher of righteousness, right? And he's the founder of this community, right? So this is one of the things that gets people really excited about the Dead Sea Scrolls. When you read some of them, they talk about things like this, and we go, hey, wait a minute, this sounds a whole lot like Jesus, right? And what's important about that is they're fairly contemporary to Jesus, right? When they're being written down, it's probably sometime towards the end of the 1st century BC into the first half of the 1st century AD, right? So it's roughly contemporary, right? So we get this person called the teacher of righteousness. He appears all over the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a community of people who found basically a monastic community on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, right? What we call the Dead Sea Scrolls are the remains of their library, which got discovered between 1946 and 1956, right? By the way, those dates are important. Think of all the things happening in Israel, Palestine during those dates, right? I mean, it's right about the time they're discovered is when Britain gives large portions of land to Jews who'd been affected by the Holocaust. We get the birth of the contemporary nation of Israel. All the stuff happening now, right, got started right at the same time the Dead Sea Scrolls are being discovered, right? And this is part of what causes all the controversy, because all of these political changes are happening. There's all this conflict, and of course this is going to involve who's got control over where the scrolls are. So if you know your history a bit and you look at my map, the community that we call this Dead Sea Scroll community is at a place called Qumran. So if you look at the map, it says Jericho, Cave 11, Cave 1, Qumran. That's where they were. Who had control of this territory in 1946 to 1956? Anybody know? Jordan. So actually, still to today, Jordan claims that they own the scrolls, even though they're all in a museum in Jerusalem. because Israel basically took them when after the war in 1967. So there's all kinds of politics involved in all of this, which we can come back to, right? But the history is, there's a community here, right? They buried their library. We'll come back to Hawaii. Sometime in 1946, a person began discovering them, right? There's other caves. So there's caves all along this area. You can see on my map there's a couple other ones. We find texts in here from as old as the 8th century BC down to the 11th century AD. But what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls are written between about the 3rd century BC into the 1st century AD. The older texts are almost all copies of the Bible, so they're copies of biblical texts, right? I'll come back to that too, right? But this is what we get. So we have this quasi-monastic community up on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, and it's founded and led by this person called the Teacher of Righteousness. Sometimes scholars call this place the Qumran community after the name, right? And you can go there. Has anybody been there? Bob has. So if you go to Israel, you want to go to the Dead Sea, you want to go to probably the most popular tourist site, which is after Jerusalem, which is Masada. All these are along the Dead Sea. It's actually fairly small, like on a bus to go from Masada to, Qumran's about half an hour. To get to Jerusalem is maybe 45 minutes, right? You can see. How big is 20, 30 miles. I mean, it's big, but it's not that big, right? I mean, Israel's small. I mean, you can drive from north to south if you get on a freeway in about 4 or 5 hours. Right? It's a small state. I mean, you're going to have to stop for things like checkpoints. That's what's going to keep you slowed down, right? Hello, Mary Jane. You're fine. So this is what we get. And if you go to Israel, you should definitely go. And then after you go swim in the Dead Sea, which is an amazing experience. You float way up on top of the water because there's so much salt in the water. Yeah.
When it's safe to do so.
Yeah.
Whoever
if we can pay for it, yes. that would be the trick, right? So you can, and when you go to the Qumran site, if you were looking at it from a distance, you wouldn't have any idea anything's there. But when you get up to it, there's holes in the ground, like they dug basements, kind of about 4 or 5 feet deep, and then they would build buildings on top of it, right? So you'd have part of the building would be underground, with only one story, but that's what they are. And so all of the buildings are burned down. The Romans come in probably 72 AD and burn everything, but the holes are the basements are still there. You can go into all of them, and they know this is where they live. This is where they copied scrolls. You can go see all of it. It's a really fun thing to do.
Like a water table or something?
They would have had to have got. So I wish I had pictures, and I could bring some of those maybe. By the way, no class next week because I'm preaching and I can't do both. But afterwards.
You're preaching.
Yeah. But you could when you go there, there's the Dead Sea, which is from a site is maybe a mile and a half. You can see it very easily because you're already kind of in the hills, and then behind you there's mountains, and there's all kinds of runoff. That's where they would have gotten all of their water. They would have needed it because the Dead Sea is the lowest area in the whole world. It's hot. I was there in 2019, just before we all moved here, and I remember we were in the Qumran site for most of the day, and we were in Masada first, which I'll talk about, and it was already 100 degrees at 9:30 in the morning. And by the time we got to the heat of the day, it was probably 110 easy, and just hot. Unbearably hot. In Jerusalem, which is maybe 20 miles away, it was 68 degrees. Because you're going up, right? You're going up to Jerusalem. That's why Jerusalem is in the mountains, right? I mean, it's cooler, right? But it's up. Yeah, I mean, you go up to Jerusalem. Yep. So this is what we have. We have this community here. This Qumran community and Jesus and his followers, they have a whole lot in common, right? Both rebelled against the Sadducees, to a lesser degree the Pharisees. We could kind of call both groups the radicalized versions of the Pharisees. Jesus is a Pharisee. That's where he comes from. That's how he was trained, right? That's why he argues with them so much, because they're his people. The Qumran community is too. They're basically an extremist group, kind of, that says, well, we aren't getting our voices heard in Jerusalem and in the temple, so we're going to go out into the wilderness and do our own thing. Right? We're going to have this community out here. We're more holy than everybody else. It's kind of who they are, right? So they get tied up often with the zealots. And if you know who the zealots are, they're a group that basically is really mad that Rome has conquered the whole area. They are going to continually rebel. They're the driving force behind the first Jewish civil war. Well, the war with Rome, where they get crushed and the temple is destroyed. Right? It's probably when the Qumran community is destroyed too. That war goes from 66 AD to 73, right? Who else goes out into the wilderness and does stuff? John the Baptist. So there's all kinds of people who want to make connections between John the Baptist and the Qumran community. So John may have been part of it. His teaching sounds a whole lot like them. These ideas of repentance, baptism, right? All of the things that John talks about. It's when we read the Qumran texts, right? They sound a lot alike, right? But Jesus too. Notice that most of Jesus's ministry is in the wilderness. He's up in Galilee, in a rural area, right? He goes down to Jerusalem every year, but he doesn't stay very long. When he does finally go to stay, he knows he's going to get killed. Right? Most of the time he's out in the wilderness. So there's all kinds of people who want to make connections with Jesus too, that maybe he went out there and hung out, right? I mean, remember we get a story of him being 12, and then all of a sudden he's 29, 30. What happens in between? We don't have any idea. He could have been hanging out with these people. All of this is speculation, right? But this is why these scrolls, when they were discovered, were so exciting. Because what they really do is they teach us what life was like in Israel outside of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. We get an idea of what at least some people are thinking and doing, right? And it transformed what we thought of ancient Israel in Jesus' time. We actually came to understand it much better, right? Yep.
Were the scrolls that people were looking for?
No. Yeah. I'll get to that. They were accidentally found, and then there's all kinds of intrigue, which leads to all the conspiracy theories, which I'll debunk. But right. So this is why they're important. I mean, they are the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, because they're the only texts that we have that were actually written in Jesus' time. So some of them are actually being written while he's alive. Right? The New Testament's obviously written afterwards, probably by a good 30 years. The Old Testament's much older, right? The only real texts we have from the first century there's a couple early Christian texts, and then we get a Jewish text by a person named Josephus, but again, he's living during the war. He's perhaps born around the time Jesus dies, right? But these are the most contemporary things we have to Jesus, right? And they help us understand this whole era, right? So because there's all these things in common, this is one reason where some of these conspiracy theories come from. So was Jesus out there with the Qumran people? Was John the Baptist out there? Are they derivative of each other, right? I already made this connection that Jesus sounds a whole lot like the teacher of righteousness. Of course, the Qumran people didn't think their teacher was the Messiah or that he was God incarnate. Did the Christians add that afterwards? There's all kinds of people who want to make these kinds of arguments. It's all speculation. Right? We don't know if there's any real connection. Other than that, there are two groups of people who seem to be thinking along a similar lines at roughly the same time. Right? What it actually tells us is that Jesus isn't that odd. There are other people with these ideas, or ideas that are similar at the same time, right? So let's talk about what's actually in them, right? So there's a few thousand manuscripts that we find. That's a lot, right, in terms of digging the things up. About 40% of them are actually just copies of the Bible. So they're just biblical texts. They're scrolls, right? We can think of these scrolls as, right, each biblical book as we think of it is on a scroll. So there's a Genesis scroll, an Exodus a scroll, and Isaiah a scroll, right? So most of what we find is just the Bible. They're reading it, right? They're taking notes in the margins, right? Things like this. They're actually then the oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have. So the interesting thing is, prior to the discovery of the scrolls, right, the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we have were 8th century AD. Wow. So we actually had our oldest copies of the Bible weren't even in the original language it was written in. They were Greek manuscripts of a translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which we talked about when we talked about the Apocrypha, right? So that's what we had. Those are the oldest texts. The only evidence we had that the Old Testament predated Jesus was a translation of the Old Testament into the Greek. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, we actually have copies of the Old Testament that are older than Jesus. And the amazing thing is they're pretty much the same as the Hebrew manuscripts we have from the 8th century.
Where are they being held?
So almost all of them are in a museum in Jerusalem. And you can go, if you go to Jerusalem, you can go see them. They have a permanent display. They are certain parts of it that they let move around. Right. Scholars usually study them from pictures, which like on the back, right? I took a doctoral seminar on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and our assignment every week, our teacher would just give us a picture like this, and we had to translate it. And so when you look at this is only consonants.
Yeah.
There aren't any vowels. I'm not going to explain all the Hebrew to you, but there's no vowels here. He would make us add all the vowels.
Oh.
So we had to, I mean, that's actually how you have to do it. Like, think about trying to read a text without any vowels.
Was his name Desai?
No, but like he was trying to really teach us how to read them, right? The handwriting's hard to read sometimes.
It looks like there are breaks between words.
Well, occasionally, yeah. I mean, this is a good one. Not all of them have it, right? But yeah, this one, I mean, they are beginning to put some spaces in, right? But there's no vowels. So I mean, this is part of why they're hard to read. You've got to figure this out. This is a really good copy, by the way. Like, so this is why, like, if you look at my prayer, there's things in brackets, right?
Those are spaces.
No, those are the holes. This is basically where they've been able to put this together, and their best educated guess of what's happening, they put in the brackets, right? Because they can the often what they do is they find multiple copies of these texts, right? And then they can compare them, and the holes aren't always in the same spot. So the worms haven't eaten the same part of the text, right? But almost always the beginnings and the ends are gone. Because you think about it, something that's rolled up, that's the part that's going to get decayed first, right? And yeah, go ahead.
Which part is it?
The beginning and the ends of the text are usually gone, right? Or the tops and the bottoms of the scroll, right? What we get is what's in the middle, right? Or this page was probably fairly early in the scroll, and so it's gotten eaten from the outside, or it's decayed from the outside.
They have the Dead Sea, right?
Yeah, almost, right? And this is a good one. I mean, you can think of this. I mean, the best scroll there is that we have a whole scroll of Isaiah, which is pretty much entirely intact. It's a miracle. Like you can, the whole thing has been unrolled carefully. The whole text is there. It's almost identical with like a Jewish text from the Middle Ages, right? So that's one thing these texts tell us is how reliably the biblical text was copied over a 1,000-year period. We should have great confidence in the Old Testament, right? But this is a good one, a good example. Oftentimes, like you can think of, they put them in jars, and I'll come back to Hawaii, right? But if there's the seals are broken, they end up decaying faster. So sometimes you open them up and they're perfectly intact. Other times you open them up and all it is little tiny puzzle pieces on the bottom, right? This is part of the reason why it took them so long to publish them, and of course that causes conspiracies. But I mean, think about what you would do if you found a jar about this tall, about this big around, and what someone had done is poured 5 2,000-piece puzzles into them. The first thing you have to do is figure out which puzzles go with which pieces go with which puzzles. So you got to sort it all out, and then you got to begin putting it all together, right? And then you have to re-examine and re-examine and re-examine because you want to make sure you put it together in the right way. So I mean, it takes about 10 years.
You got to find all the pictures.
You got to find. I mean, exactly, right? I mean, this is what you got to do. I mean, so this is, and you don't have pictures to look at either, right? And so often what they end up doing, and so I mean, you can think of you find this, right? You try to find texts that are clearly that you already know. So the first things they would put together is they're looking at them and saying, well, this looks like it's from Jeremiah. Like you've got a bunch of people who know their Hebrew Bibles really well and can put them together. And then you get all the other pieces. You try to figure out what this is, right? So this is why it's hard, right? So the first 40% are just texts out of the Bible. We find copies of every book of the Old Testament except Esther. Esther, they don't have. There isn't anything about that book, right? Well, we don't. They evidently didn't like Esther, or that we didn't find that cave, or they got destroyed. We don't know. We just haven't found it, right? So there's all kinds of apocryphal books. So we get books like Enoch, the book. So this is the other 30. So there's 40% just biblical texts. The other 30% are Jewish texts that didn't make the canon. So we get books like Jubilees, Enoch. We actually have one. So it's just pieces, but one Hebrew copy of the book of Tobit. So we talked about the Apocrypha. We said these books didn't make the canon because we didn't have any Hebrew copies. Well, in the 1950s, we have a partial manuscript in fragments of a Hebrew copy of the book of Tobit. Now, we don't know if this is an original Hebrew copy and it got translated into Greek out of it, or if the Greek is the original, it got translated into Hebrew. We don't know any of these things, but we have them. So there's a bunch of those kinds of texts there too, right? Again, the important thing is what this actually does for us is it gives us great confidence in the reliability of the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament, as we had it in the Middle Ages from all these Jewish texts in synagogues, is almost perfectly identical with the text we find at the Dead Sea 1,000 years earlier, right? So that's a 70% biblical books and sort of apocryphal books. The other 30% are texts that are particular to the community. So we get things like their receipts, right? We also get, they're basically a monastic community, so we get their rules, the prayer I had you read is from one of their rules. Like they have books of here's how we're going to manage our community, like a monastery. We get their prayers, we get liturgies from their co-worship, and what I personally think are the really interesting thing, and this is the book I brought, we get their commentaries. So they actually wrote commentaries on some of the biblical books, right? And well, that's a Mishnah. We call the commentaries pesharim. That's what that's the Hebrew word, but it's basically commenting on Scripture. But that's interesting. We get to see how some Jews, at least in the first century, were interpreting the Old Testament. Right. Yeah, and that's actually what it is. What's really interesting is they actually give you the text. So this one has things like, there's almost a complete commentary on Habakkuk and on Micah. So they're small books, but they give you the biblical text and then they comment on it, just like a modern commentary, right? Because again, that's what we get, right? And what they really help us do is to understand again what people were thinking in this time, right? They don't have all these hidden secrets in them. They just help us to see what were people actually thinking at this time. So here's one of the biggest examples. One thing these texts teach us is they did not believe in a salvation by works. They clearly had a grace-filled understanding of salvation. We're saved by grace. We do good works in response to what God has done for us. But God, well, I mean, it's kind of the idea, right? And so, here's what's really interesting. So, Luther, his whole sort of reformation is rooted in this idea of Jesus and Paul are teaching a gospel of a salvation by grace alone against the Jews who were teaching us a gospel of a salvation by good works. So Luther assumes the Jews think a salvation is by good works. Jesus and Paul repudiate that. That's how he comes to understand the gospel and pushes back against the Catholics, right? Problem is, Luther's wrong about the Jews. So they're already, that's one of the things we actually learn is actually the Old Testament's all about grace. We've just misread it, right? It actually helps the Protestant cause, but it also at the cost of saying Luther got it wrong, right?
May I ask?
Yep.
This is that book in the commentary.
Well, this is from a series of books that, like, they're trying to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls text.
If you had a shelf full of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls sitting on a shelf, would it be like the Encyclopedia Britannica?
Well, I mean, it probably isn't that big, but you've got the Hebrew on one side, in English translation on the other, right? Some notes on the bottom.
So just put it on a shelf. You had a whole set of those.
Like this.
Oh, okay.
Like probably maybe a little smaller than a big in encyclopedia. But again, this is the 30% that aren't biblical texts, right? I mean, the really interesting thing, I mean, that's what people don't oftentimes understand. The real value here is actually we get all these old copies of the Bible, right? That we can then go read and compare, right? These things are also helpful, but the real helpful thing is we get these actual texts, right, from the Old Testament, right? And it changes how we understood Judaism, right? So the real thing that the scrolls have done for scholars is we've actually come to have a much better understanding of what Judaism was like in Jesus' day. It's much more diverse than we knew. It's much more complicated. It's all kinds of different ideas, and there's a lot more grace. Doug?
Is there a difference between scrolls found in one place and scrolls found in other places if they're all of the same, like Isaiah or whatever? You know, is there...
Well, so if you look at my map, right, you see where the Qumran is. There's 12 caves around Qumran where we find texts that are from the Qumran community, right? And the way we can tell this is you can carbon date the paper or the vellum that they're on, so we can date them. What we really do is tell it by handwriting. So I was talking about this doctoral seminar I took. I didn't spend enough time doing this, as this isn't my specialty, but a teacher, by the way, this is his book, Charles Worth. He could actually tell you within about 20 to 30 years when the text was written by the handwriting. Right, because handwriting, think about like when your parents' handwriting compared to your handwriting, compared to your kids. Our handwriting evolves over time. It's influenced by all kinds of things. So you can actually date text by people's handwriting. This is one thing that we can do.
Assuming that it's written by the signature.
Well, but that's, even then, you could do this now, like people from different countries will have their handwriting, they'll make certain letters in the same shape. So we can date things and tell where it's from based on the handwriting. There's a whole science to this. Again, it's not perfect, but it's fairly reliable, right? Phrasing, right, all those sorts of things, right? Yeah.
Well, if they're old copies of English text, sometimes you get Dover books
Yep.
that are photocopies of older books, and the F and the S.
Right.
Yes.
They're kind of indistinguishable from my
Yep.
perspective.
Yep. But well, you're right. So they're using there's some different letter shapes that actually comes from the German publishing, right? But we could do the same thing with handwriting. Bob, you had your hand up.
Is there anything to when Jerusalem was being threatened during the Roman War, that there were texts and scrolls that were moved from Jerusalem and hidden in these caves? These all, that not all of these were written, by the Essenes, but there's a mixture from Jerusalem that was hidden there.
So it's very hard to tell if that's the case. So people have proposed that idea. The majority idea is when this group left Jerusalem, probably right around the turn from BC to AD, right? That's probably when they really went out to the wilderness. Maybe a little bit earlier. They brought texts with them from Jerusalem, and those were in their libraries, right? Whether or not they actually took texts out. But this isn't important. The whole Jewish war is going to be real important. I'll come to that in just a minute, right? Actually, I think it would actually be helpful to ask this question of, so why are all these scrolls out of these caves in the first place, right? Because it isn't where you usually keep stuff, right? So sometime around 70 AD, right, the Romans were trying to squash this Jewish rebellion led by the Zealots, right? So 70 AD, they go to Jerusalem, they destroy it, they destroy the temple, all of it, right? But this isn't the end of the war. There's still plenty of other places. So if you go down to, on my map, on the bottom of the map is Masada. If you don't know what that is, it's a huge fortress, basically built on a plateau. It's basically a small mountain with the top of it's just flat, and part of it they did that on purpose. They went up there and just cut the top of the mountain off to build this big military fort up there. Actually, it was built by Herod the Great. So isn't that old, right? When it's in this time, but there's if you can imagine a mountain with a flat top, all along the top is a wall, and then inside there's another wall, and they've got cisterns and food storage and all kinds of things up there. It was the last holdout of the Jewish forces. And the Romans attack it. You can actually, there's the ramp they built, the earthen ramp is still there. I've run up it. It takes about 5 minutes at a sprint. I raced a bunch of my students up it, and I came in pretty much last. Right? But you can actually go up it, right? And what happened was the Romans besieged this fort for like months. And we don't really know what happened. Either the Romans finally got in and killed them all. The sort of history is the Jews inside finally committed suicide rather than being captured, right? That's so, but it's this big kind of historical site. You know, if you're a Jewish kid in Israel, you'll take a field trip there during your sort of junior high days. You can go up there and see all of it, right? So, but you can see where it is, and the way they would have gotten there is to come from Jerusalem and come down along the Dead Sea. That's where the road goes. They would have been within a stone's throw of Qumran on their way to Masada. And they probably intentionally stopped to destroy it because they knew it had connections with the Zealots. So probably 72 AD, this was happening. The people at Qumran knew it was going to happen. So they went and got their library and put it in these stone jars and hid them in caves. The caves, there's 12 caves, all but one are artificial. So they actually dug the caves out into this soft rock. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Going back to Masada,
Yep.
wasn't that ramp created by the...
Yeah, by the Romans, they built the ramp, and it's still there. Like they don't take it down afterwards.
In fact, you can see where the Romans camped.
Yeah, you can see you can when you get up top on the end of the fort, you can look down and yeah, you can see their camp. It's still there, like where they had their like tents, because they basically put it in a grid, and the streets are still there.
Have some vague memory that associated with these communities that they either drove off a cliff or people jumped off a cliff.
Well, there was.
Is that like the suicide?
Some of that. I mean, there's a room that they're pretty sure all these people just died in. And it looks like group suicide. There were other people who did kind of like climb up on the wall and hop off. You would fall about 500 feet, right? But I mean, what are you going to do if you're starving, right? You've been under a siege for a month. You're running out of water, right? It's a war. It's awful, right? But so on their way to do that, the Romans would have stopped here. The Qumran people would have realized this was going to happen. They hide their texts. Now, why would they put them in stone jars? This is a traditional Jewish way of getting rid of old texts. If the Bible is God's word, you don't throw it in the garbage. You don't burn it. You don't do any of these things, right?
It's not like...
Right, it's not like, I mean, you can take, your romance novel and toss it in the garbage, who cares? But you don't do that with the Bible. What you do is let nature, God's good creation, take care of it. So you let the text decay. And you do this by putting them in these jars and putting them in a cave and storing them away. So they probably took their library and did this intentionally so that if the Romans did find it, they did go up to these caves, they think they're just old texts and they leave them alone. So they're hiding them, right? They're camouflaging them. So they put them up there, right? And they didn't ever come back for them. So we don't know if they got killed, if they got pushed out and couldn't come back. We don't know what happened. Other than that, no one touched them from probably 72 AD until 1946. What happened in 1946 is a Bedouin, a shepherd is out in this area with his sheep. He throws a rock into what's called Cave 1, and he hears something break. And he goes, I wonder what that is. So he climbs up there, goes into the cave, and a rock had hit one of these jars and broken it. He sees a scroll in there. He's like, I'm going to make some money So he takes it into town, into Jerusalem, and tries to sell it on the antiquities market. And people basically think it's a text from the Middle Ages and offer him basically the equivalent of a couple dollars, which today would be a couple hundred dollars, right? Now he's a poor shepherd, right? He says yes, but then the dealer says, I won't take it. I think you stole these from a synagogue. So the dealer actually thought they were old text sitting in a synagogue waiting to just decay. Because that's also what happens. They'll just put them in the back of a synagogue and let them rot on a shelf. Right? They didn't have carpet. Well, I mean, they did, but I mean, they're not thinking of this yet. I mean, this is Jerusalem in 1947. It's chaos. There's already like walls in the city. Here's the Palestinian part. Here's the Christian. I mean, if you've been to Jerusalem, it's south, the old city. There's the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Muslim quarter. I mean, they're dividing it up. So it's hard to get from one place to the other, right? So he's trying to sell them. He's being accused of stealing them, right? Eventually, a person who's a member of the Assyrian Orthodox Church thinks maybe, he looks at the script and says, this doesn't look like Hebrew, because it doesn't look like a modern Hebrew. He thinks maybe it's a Syriac. I'll buy them for our church. He thinks they're Christian texts, right? So he buys them and shows it to his bishop. His bishop instantly goes, this is not a Syriac text. This is a really, really, really old Hebrew text. And goes and buys as many as he can, right? Gets some experts basically from Europe and America to come look at them, gets taken onto the cave, and they're like, this is old. This is pre-Jesus or first century at least. We've got something really amazing on our hands, right? But this is all happening when all this conflict is happening. So they're arguing over how to pay. They have to when they did this first exchange, they had to pass the scrolls through like a barbed wire fence and look at them and then pass them back. Right? So this is why there's all this conspiracy, is the conditions under which they were discovered were weird, right? I mean, we get these Bedouins who just go and find them. They're trying to sell them to make money. There's people finding them and saying, we have something interesting here, right? Half of them are found on the black market, right? The Bedouins find all these other caves and they don't tell anybody because they want to make money. Eventually the authorities go out there and catch them doing this, and they lock down the whole area and turn it into an archaeological dig, right? And then they find all of these scrolls, right? And then there's controversy afterwards, because who's actually a scholar who can basically figure out what they have on their hands? Only people who are there who could do this are the Christians. So there's all these Catholic orders, the Jesuits and the Franciscans, and a bit of the Dominicans, who have a presence in the Holy Land. These are guys who are pure, they have PhDs, right? And they realize what's going on. They want to look at all these texts. So they're the ones who start studying them and publishing on them. But because of the conditions of the text, because of all this other intrigue and politics, it takes a long time. And people come up with all these conspiracy theories of this disproves Christianity and the Catholic Church is hiding them and all these sorts of things, right? That's where those stories come from, right? And then there's just there's all this problems of whose territory is it? There's arguments between Jordan and Israel. How do you publish them? So there's waves of publication. First, they just publish pictures of them, which are really hard to read. Then people actually, they type it all in, right? But then you have to cipher them. You got to put text together. I mean, we're still publishing Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time. They're still like, if you go to the museums and get be behind the scenes, you can pull out trays of just little tiny pieces. And there's people who's like, they'll spend 10 years trying to put these pieces together, right? So that's what they are, that's where they come from, right? Questions in the few minutes we have left.
So there's a book,
Yeah.
complete Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right, I mean, it's complete, right? And notice which edition it is. The 7th edition, right? I mean, they keep publishing this because there's more and more things, right? And even when they say complete, this is only things that aren't biblical texts or apocryphal texts, right? And that's a book. It's about this big. It's about an 800-page, Penguin paperback, small print. And it's all done by one guy. I mean, the real things you want to read are things like this. But this book, this is probably 20 pages in that Penguin book, everything in here. This has got the original Hebrew, the English, commentary, right, all those sorts of things. This book costs $130, right? I mean, the Penguin book costs $20 for all of it, right? So that's part of the issue, but.
Book in Fargo, when we lived up there, that says Dead Sea Scrolls on it. It's about this thick.
Yeah.
And it looks brand new, but it's got sort of a blonde, hard cloth.
Yeah.
And I think I paid $40 for it in a used bookstore.
Yeah.
He wouldn't come down. I said, well, what about it?
Right.
No, $40 solid, but it's
Right.
too intimidating.
Yeah.
And I opened it up once and I looked and I said, oh.
Yeah,
not
right.
something.
Yeah, next on the shelf, right. Well, I think this is what feeds some of the conspiracies of it took so long to publish them. There's all this intrigue, right? People are paying people off trying to get their hands on them, right? Because it is this huge archaeological discovery, right? And early on, people were, they were buying them for basically $10, $15. And then people start to go, wait a minute, this is really important. I want thousands of dollars, right? And
Wasn't there a man locally that had the scriptorium that actually bought a bunch of this stuff and put it in a museum?
I don't know about that, but I mean,
Before his time in
Right.
the
right, and
What's his name? Ben Campbell.
right, and there's all this intrigue. I mean, and then you can think of all of this happening. Then there were people who actually made like fake ones. They're trying to make money and capitalize on it, right? So all of that is what's behind all the conspiracy theories. Really, it's just a really important discovery that we're still coming to terms with.
Do they think that they have found?
Yeah, they think they found them all. I mean, there's still people who go out and try to find caves.
In that
right?
area.
In that area, right? But I mean, now it's all, the Israeli government has teams that go out and like look for this, right? Because they want to get their hands on them. They don't want them ending up on the antiquities market, right? Because that's the problem with that. If I go out to one of these caves and find a manuscript and pull it out and hide it, and then try to go sell it, it becomes really hard to date because it's not coming from the place where it was, right? We don't know who it's associated with, right? So there probably are a couple of these texts that we think are dead Sea Scrolls that really aren't, and there are other things in other collections that really are dead Sea Scrolls, right?
Do you feel that the actual scrolls right now are in safe hands, just from your experiences and from? So
again, the bulk of them are in it's the Jewish History Museum in Jerusalem. They're very well taken care of. If you, you can. There's this Go Mobile exhibit. I didn't see the one in Grand Rapids, but I saw them when they were in Chicago. they keep the whole room like dark, like because it's old paper, right? You don't want to expose it to light. In the museum, everything is under fire suppression. They're behind thick glass, right? They're very well protected. I mean, I guess you could bomb the museum. I mean, what would you do with it, right?
With all the strife that's going on right now, is this something that's, in your mind, being protected by the government?
They are. I mean, they're very much taking care of them. The other, I mean, this isn't a perfect solution, but in the last 20 years or so, I mean, our technology has gotten so good. I mean, all of them have been carefully photographed now with high definition cameras. So there's digital records of all of this. Now again, a picture isn't ever the same as the real thing, but we have all that, right? They're not going to get lost.
As long as technology can last.
Right. As long as it lasts, right?
Well, maybe it could be heard not only
Right.
those shots.
Yeah. Well, we're up for time, so thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck, Norm. See you later. Quickly.
Yeah.